an attorney gets brutalized by a court cop. Put up her picture full mask. You see this? She's a defense attorney. Beaten, according to the allegation, by a courthouse police officer. Defense lawyer Sudeen Riley says she was left bloody, she was left swollen after multiple police officers in Durham Regional slammed her head on a desk without provocation, ripped off her scarf without provocation, and dragged her to the basement cells of the Oshawa Courthouse last month. Okay? This is in Durham, according to a statement issued by Riley's lawyer, Neha Chu. Defense attorney Sudeen Riley finished a trial late January 23rd and was catching up on legal work in an interview room when uniformed officers, quote, challenged her presence, end quote, in that room. In her statement, the attorney said police who were working as security slammed Riley's head on the desk and put her knees on her back and neck and spoke to her with rage, disrespect, and contempt, end quote. She said officers then forcibly dragged Riley from the room in handcuffs and took her to the basement cells of the courthouse. Quote, her headscarf was ripped off, her skirt was raised when she was handcuffed by officers, and her head was bleeding and her eyes swollen from being slammed into the desk. The attorney's statement reads, she committed no offense other than being a black woman practicing law, being diligent about her commitment to the pursuit of justice, end quote. The attorney's statement does not indicate how many officers were involved.
She had just finished her trial, not fleeing a crime scene, not breaking into somewhere she didn't belong. She had just spent the day inside a courthouse, doing her job, defending someone who needed her. And when the day was done, she stayed a little longer, because that is what dedicated attorneys do. She was catching up on paperwork. She was being diligent. She was, by every definition of the word, exactly where she was supposed to be. And then they slammed her head into a desk. Here's what I need you to sit with before we go any further. The moment I just described did not happen in a dark parking garage. It did not happen in a back alley. It happened inside a courthouse. The very building society constructed to dispense justice. The very institution Sudeen Riley had spent her career serving. And what happened to her inside those walls forces every single one of us to answer a question that goes far deeper than one woman, one courthouse, or one January afternoon in Durham. We all believe that doing the right thing protects us. We believe education is armor. We believe credentials open doors. We believe that a license to practice law, the framed document, the bar membership, the years of sacrifice means something. But what happens when the armor fails? What happens when everything you built to keep yourself safe becomes invisible the moment someone looks at you and decides they've already made up their mind? This is a case of defense attorney Sudeen Riley, and it will stay with you long after this video ends. Sudeen Riley is not a name that should need to be on the internet right now. She should be anonymous in the best possible way. Quietly building her career, winning and losing cases in courtrooms, living her life in the ordinary and beautiful way that most lawyers do. She is a defense attorney, which means she chose the harder side of the law. Defense attorneys do not get to pick sympathetic clients. They do not get the luxury of prosecutorial righteousness. They choose to stand between the state and the accused because they understand something fundamental about how justice works, that the system is only as good as its least powerful defendant, that the test of civilization is how it treats the person with the least protection. Think about the kind of person who chooses that work. Think about what it costs. The late nights, the clients who don't say thank you, the cases you believe in and lose, the system you fight against and still choose to serve. Sudine Riley didn't stumble into defense law. She committed to it. She put on professional clothes that January morning. She walked into the Durham Regional Courthouse, and she spent the day doing the work she trained years to do. She finished her trial late in the afternoon, January 23rd. She could have gone home. Most people, after a full trial day, go home, but she didn't. She moved to an interview room, the kind of room that exists specifically for attorneys to work with clients, to review documents, to do the unglamorous labor that the law actually requires. She sat down. She kept working. She was, in every observable sense, doing exactly what a conscientious attorney does. And then uniformed courthouse security officers opened the door. What happened next is the kind of thing that, when you hear it described plainly, sounds impossible. Not impossible the way a magic trick sounds impossible. Impossible the way a nightmare sounds impossible. The kind where you're screaming and no one can hear you, and the place you thought was safe turns out to be the most dangerous place in the room. According to the statement issued by Riley's attorney, Nia Chu, officers challenged Riley's presence in that room. They did not ask politely. They did not review her credentials. They did not run a routine check. They challenged her. And then before any of that could resolve, before any identification could be verified, before any conversation could happen, they acted. They slammed her head into the desk. Read that again slowly, because the speed at which we consume terrible news sometimes protects us from actually feeling it. They took the head of a licensed defense attorney who was doing paperwork inside a courthouse, and they drove it into the surface of a desk. Then they put their knees on her back, on her neck. They handcuffed her. They ripped her headscarf off. When she was handcuffed and restrained, her skirt was raised. They dragged her out of that room and took her to the basement cells of the courthouse, where she had spent the day working as an officer of the law. She was bleeding from her head. Her eyes were swollen. And this is the part that speaks to something beyond one incident, they charged her with trespassing. Here's where the story stops making sense on the surface. And I say on the surface, because underneath, it makes a particular kind of terrible sense that we need to talk about. Sudine Riley holds a valid license to practice law in Ontario. She had been inside that courthouse all day. She was in an interview room designed for attorney use. She was, by every legal and professional standard, authorized to be exactly where she was. And the people who detained her, the people who left her bloody and swollen, responded to the aftermath of what they had done by arresting her, not themselves. Let's stay with that inversion for a moment, because the brain wants to move past it quickly, and we shouldn't let it. The default institutional response to a documented incident of brutality against a licensed attorney inside a courthouse was to criminalize the victim, to reach for the charge of trespassing against someone who, by definition, cannot trespass in a building she is professionally authorized to occupy. The charge itself is the message. The charge says, we are still in control of the narrative. The charge says, you caused this. The charge says, we decide who belongs here. Her attorney's statement was plain and deliberate. She committed no offense other than being a black woman practicing law, being diligent about her commitment to the pursuit of justice. Durham Regional Police Services, the DRPS, confirmed they opened an investigation. A sergeant issued a statement. The service said it was working with court services to obtain and review all evidence. The officers involved were reassigned away from courthouse security. The appropriate agencies were notified, including the Special Investigations Unit, the body designed to handle serious incidents involving police. And then the Special Investigations Unit decided not to pursue an investigation. Remember that. It becomes important. CBC News asked the Durham Regional Police Services a simple, reasonable question. Given that this investigation involves allegations against your own officers, would the DRPS be passing an investigation to another independent police service? The response was not yes. The response was not even a nuanced explanation of why independence might be difficult. The response was, in essence, we are taking the allegations with the utmost seriousness. Trust us. Think about the architecture of that answer. The institution being accused of brutality is also the institution responsible for investigating the brutality. And when a news organization raises the obvious conflict of interest embedded in that arrangement, The response is not structural, it is reputational. We are trustworthy. You're going to have to take our word for it. This is not a new pattern. And that matters, because what happened to Sudeen Riley did not emerge from nowhere. It did not fall from the sky, fully formed. It grew from soil that had been cultivated for decades. And the evidence for that is not anecdotal. It is institutional. It is documented. It is, in 2024, confirmed. The Ontario Human Rights Commission, in its 2024 final report, confirmed the existence of discriminatory policing practices in Toronto, citing the overrepresentation of the Black community in street checks and in incidents involving the use of force. This is not advocacy language. This is a language of an official government body, after official investigation, reaching an official conclusion. And the BC Civil Liberties Association went further, accusing police of actively denying systemic racism and delaying reform by resisting race-based data collection. Here is what that means in plain language. The people who could measure the problem have been working to avoid measuring it, because data is dangerous. Data removes the luxury of claiming ignorance. Data says, we know and we chose not to change. Now think about what it means that Sudeen Riley, a defense attorney inside a courthouse, doing paperwork, was left with a bleeding head and swollen eyes on January 23rd. Think about what it means that the professional armor she spent her life building was not just insufficient, it was irrelevant, because the decision about who she was, and what she deserved, and whether she belonged in that room, appears to have been made before anyone checked her credentials. Let's talk about what an investigation into an incident like this should actually look like, because the mechanics matter, and the way institutions respond to allegations tells us as much as the allegations themselves. When police are accused of brutality, the gold standard, the thing that preserves the integrity of any findings, is independent investigation, not because all internal investigators are corrupt, but because the structural appearance of impartiality matters to the credibility of any outcome. If DRPS investigates DRPS and concludes that DRPS officers did nothing wrong, that conclusion will carry no weight with anyone who had a stake in the outcome, regardless of whether the investigation was thorough. This is not cynicism. This is how institutional trust works. You cannot be both the accused and the arbiter. The Special Investigations Unit, the Ontario body designed to handle exactly these situations, declined to investigate. The reasons for that declination have not been fully made public. But consider what it means that the independent body specifically constructed to provide oversight chose not to engage. That vacuum of independent scrutiny is now filled entirely by the institution whose officers are accused. Every finding, every determination, every conclusion will come from inside the house being investigated. Sudeen Riley is traumatized. Her attorney said so. Not as a legal argument, as a human statement. She is traumatized, a woman who went to work, who did her job with diligence and dedication, who stayed late because she cared about the work, ended the day in handcuffs in a basement with blood on her head. The professional and the personal are not separate for her now. Every time she walks into a courthouse going forward, she will carry that January afternoon with her. Every time she's in a building with uniformed security, some part of her nervous system will remember. That is a cost that doesn't show up in any official statement. That is a cost that no investigation addresses, no matter how thorough. The body heals. The eyes unswell. The head stops bleeding. But the way you move through spaces you used to feel safe in, that changes in ways that are harder to quantify and impossible to return. And here's what haunts me about the broader frame of this story. Sudeen Riley had done everything right. Not just legally, not just procedurally. Morally, she had committed her career to the most structurally vulnerable people in the legal system. She had built herself into someone equipped to fight for others. She had education, credentials, institutional access, professional standing. She had every marker of legitimacy that the system claims to recognize. And none of it was enough to prevent what happened in that room. So what does that say to someone with less? What does it say to someone who doesn't have the legal training to know what her rights were? What does it say to someone who doesn't have an attorney to issue a statement on their behalf, who doesn't have access to CBC News, who isn't a professional with institutional standing? If the armor didn't work for Sudeen Riley, what exactly are we telling people who have less armor than she did? That is a philosophical rupture at the center of this case, and it's a question that the trespassing charge cannot close, that the reassignment of officers cannot close, that any internal investigation cannot close. We construct systems and tell people, follow the rules, earn the credentials, walk the right path, and you will be protected. And most of the time, the people who need to believe that most fervently are the people for whom protection is most conditional. The faith required to keep showing up, to keep walking into courthouses, to keep doing the work, to keep believing that the institution is improvable, is enormous. It is an act of will that most of us have never been asked to perform. Sudeen Riley showed up on January 23rd because she believed the work mattered, because she believed enough in the pursuit of justice to stay late and do her paperwork when she could have gone home. That belief cost her something. And what it cost her, beyond the physical injuries, beyond the legal indignity of a trespassing charge, is something harder to name. The question of whether belief in a system that harms you is an act of courage or an act of complicity. Whether continuing to work inside an institution that can do this to you makes the institution better or just more comfortable. I don't have a clean answer to that. And I think the absence of a clean answer is exactly where this case lives. The DRPS says the investigation is ongoing. The officers have been reassigned. Statements have been issued. The machinery of institutional response is moving in its slow and careful way. And Sudeen Riley is recovering, physically, professionally, and in ways that no official timeline will track. What I keep returning to is a single image, a defense attorney, late afternoon, an interview room, papers spread out on a desk, because she was committed to doing her work well. And then the door opens. And in the space between that door opening and the moment her head hit the desk, what was the thought? What was the split-second calculation? Was it confusion? Was it the professional instinct to de-escalate? Was it the terrible, clear recognition of what was happening and why? We will probably never know that, because that interior moment belongs to her and cannot be recovered by any investigation. Here's what I know. Every system that fails the people who trust it most creates a specific kind of damage, not just to the individual, not just to the community that watches and learns what protection is actually available to them, but to the idea that the system can be trusted at all. And that erosion is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the attorney who hesitates before staying late. It is the law student who recalculates what a career in the courtroom will cost. It is the client who wonders whether their lawyer is safe enough to advocate for them. Sudeen Riley walked into a courthouse on January 23rd as a defense attorney. She should have walked out the same way. The fact that she didn't, and the institutional response that followed, is not just her story. It is a story about what justice means when it is selectively applied, about who gets to feel safe in the buildings we build to dispense it, about the distance between what our systems promise and what they deliver. And I want to ask you something directly, because this case deserves more than passive consumption. When you think about the institutions you trust protect you, the ones you've arranged your life around believing in, what does it take for that trust to hold? And what happens to you, to your choices, to your sense of what's possible if it breaks? Where is your line between faith in a system and clear-eyed reckoning with what that system actually does? Leave your honest answer below. This case is not about monsters and heroes. It is about systems that protect some people and harm others, and the ones who keep showing up anyway because they believe the work matters. That kind of persistence deserves to be witnessed. If this case moved you, if the weight of it settled somewhere in your chest the way it settled in mine, hit like. It tells the algorithm that stories like Sudeen Riley's deserve to reach more people. Subscribe, because the cases I bring you are not just crime stories. They are questions about power, about who is protected, and about the gap between what justice is supposed to be and what it sometimes is. Sudeen Riley stayed late because she cared about the work. That should have been enough. The fact that it wasn't, that is the thing that will stay with me. And I think it will stay with you too.